All right, we're glad that you've joined us. We just finished a series called Why Baptist, where we talked about Baptist distinctives. And we went through this acrostic defining what it means to be a Baptist. And we talked about B as in biblical authority, A, autonomy of the local church, P, priesthood of all believers, T, two ordinances, I, individual soul liberty, S, saved church membership, T, two offices, and then S, separation of church and state. We want to continue that conversation thinking about what it means to be a Baptist. And I've got my friend here who is an ordained Baptist minister, Jonathan Holste. He's a seminary buddy, so we did our master's work at Southeastern Seminary together. He's currently completing a PhD in New Testament, so he likes to think about the Bible, think about theology. And then just as an interesting factoid, he is a former Marine who served in Afghanistan, was it? Iraq. And did his tour there. So he's got an interesting perspective on Baptist life, a committed Baptist like myself. So we want to have this conversation about what it means to be Baptist, why it's important, and why maybe you should consider being Baptist. So I've outlined some of those key distinctives for being Baptist. And in the videos that I did, I emphasized freedom. I emphasized the fact that Baptists have total freedom in their local churches. We have freedom even as individuals before God. But in your mind, what would you say are the key distinctions of a Baptist?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for letting me be here and joining you in conversation. It's always a pleasure to be with you. We've known each other a long time. And I've been a part of Baptist life for a long time. One thing you didn't mention is that I'm also a missionary kid. So
That's
as long
right.
as I can remember, I've been involved in Baptist life. So for me, there's a couple of obvious answers to sort of the Baptist distinctives. You can't really be Baptist if you don't have believers' baptism.
Okay.
Right? That's necessary but not sufficient. You can be a church that practices believers' baptism that is not necessarily Baptist as we would understand in terms of denomination. There are other distinctives, biblical authority. Some people say no creed but the Bible, but biblical authority. But for me, if I had to pick one single distinctive that is most important, it would be what I think you listed as individual soul freedom, or as it's often said, soul competency. For me, this emphasis that we have on freedom is right in the sense that Baptists have always asserted their freedom over their own affairs in local churches, over their own decisions in terms of their faith, freedom from external human authorities, ecclesiastical authorities, governmental authorities. But there's a flip side to that coin. It's not just freedom, it's responsibility. We believe we are responsible before God for what we say, for what we do, and for what we believe. The freedom isn't an end into itself. It's a means to that end of standing responsible before God. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, "For we all must appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each may receive recompense for what has been done in the body, whether good or evil." So when we view the Baptist distinctives through that lens, I think we get the proper perspective. So talk about biblical authority. We say, we're not beholden to any authoritative tradition or creed or doctrinal proclamation. But it's not just because we're throwing out all of history and all of Christian tradition, and not because we don't believe these things, but rather because we believe we are responsible to God to test all of these traditions, every theological claim, by the one authoritative, sufficient rule of our faith, and that's the Bible. So we have this duty. It's not about being free from tradition. It's about obeying our duty to follow the example of the Bereans, to read the scriptures and see whether these things are so. And so it goes through the distinctives. You could talk about the autonomy of the local church. Yeah, we're free to do what we want. We don't have bishops telling us what to do and that sort of thing. But it's not about freedom. It's about the fact that we as a local assembly of baptized believers are responsible to God for what we do together. There's no external person or external assembly that can tell us as a local assembly what to do. They can't take the fall when we act badly, and they can't order us to do the right thing. We have to take responsibility before God for our actions. So I think, for me, that sole competency is sort of at the core of what it means to be a Baptist.
Okay. So yeah, Baptists get sometimes a bad rap from people who would criticize Baptists as being, well, you all do whatever you want. You just make up everything as you go along. But in fact, there is real responsibility in the Baptist tradition. It's not that Baptists just say, well, we're going to do whatever we want. It is that we feel, we're convicted by the reality that we do answer before God, which brings great responsibility, whether we're talking about our church life or our individual life, as you said. So there is this balance, right, of responsibility and freedom in those distinctives.
Absolutely.
Good. What do you think comes to mind when most people hear of Baptist or think of Baptist?
Well, I think, frankly, in our day and age, often it's not going to be a positive reaction. I think within sort of the American context, a lot of times people are going to think of Baptists as particularly political people. Right? Baptists who want to be involved in the personal decisions of other people. I think that that's unfortunately, sort of...
Can you think of any examples of that offhand?
Well, I think that there definitely has been maybe passing now, but there was a political movement among broader evangelicalism, but especially championed by certain Baptists, that sought to use the mechanisms of state to impose sort of our personal convictions on sort of the broader American context. And as we've seen in discussing these Baptist distinctives, that's something that's actually not particularly consistent with our own Baptistic principles. And I think also within the broader Christian world, we're seen as sort of rootless people, as we've talked about, without a history, without a tradition, and that's from the outside. But I think that actually we as Baptists have a lot to offer. We are champions of personal liberty. We are champions of separation of church and state. We are, as we've just talked about, champions of being responsible before God for our actions. And I think these are all positive things that we bring to the table that maybe not everybody sees these days.
So what do you think, why do you think people have this perception of Baptists that we're sort of angry or ignorant, Bible thumpers, that want to shout at the culture, shake our fist at the world, tell everyone they're going to hell? Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think that many people who even grew up in Baptist churches had an experience that wasn't too far off from that. That's not necessarily the norm in Baptist life, but it's not necessarily, particularly unusual either from time to time. Yeah. And we cannot abdicate responsibility for the perception that other people have of us.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that some of that should, have us take a good hard look at ourselves. And our job isn't to make everybody like us. Our job is to be faithful. And if being faithful makes some people have negative reactions, then so be it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to seek out negative reactions and that we're sort of doing our job if we get those.
Right. If people are mad at us, we've done something right. And I think that's what comes to mind for a lot of people. Westboro Baptist got such news attention over the last decade. Of course, they faded out now, but with their protest and awful things that they did. Yeah. And that's a brand of Baptist, but not what we're talking about either. Not really a historical version of Baptist at all. Not one that recognizes its roots or its responsibility before God. So I thought it might be fun if we talked about some of the more interesting or outlandish things you've heard about in Baptist churches. I've heard of several. Of course, I grew up in West Virginia. Snake handling was still a thing, like actually Baptists doing that. And I remember my own family was invited to see Big Red, the largest snake in this particular Baptist conference that was going to be there for
Really?
a special revival event.
I didn't know that.
My mom met a man whose thumb was black, who was still believing that God was going to heal him from the snake bite. Of course, that thumb was long gone when it's black. And not in the hospital. So those are a couple of things I think about. Or I grew up Free Will Baptist outside the Southern Baptist life, and we're not really talking about all the minute distinctions between Free Will Baptist and Southern Baptist and Missionary Baptist and all the regular Baptists, all the different groups that are out there. But another one was just the blending of, this almost goes on the political sphere, but it's almost a step further and it's more comical, would be I remember one Sunday we had testimony time because, freedom, individual response to God, that's a big thing for Baptists. So this man got up and said he wanted to thank God for the football game yesterday because God clearly gave West Virginia University the victory. Those sorts of things are some of the comical things I think about in my experience in Baptist life. Can you think of anything that you've either seen or heard of happening in Baptist life that would be that sort of turn off for people?
Turn off, comical. I mean, I can answer both.
Yeah, well, whatever.
As you've mentioned,
I think
football
I can
and
go on
religion
too.
tend to merge in the South.
Yeah.
You always see that kind of stuff, and I think that's not just limited to Baptist life, where people blend religion with the things that are important to them, whether they're football or politics or whatever. And people are always seeking to have God on their side, whereas we should rather always seek to be on God's side, which is a different thing, right?
Yeah.
And if you're trying to be on God's side by being on the right football team, then I think you're going down the wrong road. But you do see stuff. We like to be patriotic in Baptist circles. You mentioned that I served in the Marine Corps. I'm proud of that. I love my country. But there have been times when I've been very, very uncomfortable in patriotic services in Baptist life. There was actually a time when I was at sort of a prominent church. I won't name it. But, large American flag in the background for this service, and the special number was a song about the American flag. It didn't have anything to do with God whatsoever. But then at the key change, the congregation sort of reacted like they often did during, a special number about God, the Spirit moving, everybody stood, hands were in the air, and it was frankly idolatrous at that moment. And I'm not saying every patriotic service is necessarily negative. I'm not saying that we shouldn't support our country as Baptists, but we need to be careful that God is always the main thing, right? Whether it's something silly like football that we care about or something really important like the country. When we gather here together as believers, it's to worship and serve the Almighty God.
Yeah. That's I think an open. Lots of other denominations critique Baptist on that point because we don't have any real guardrails for that. Even though we of all people should have the guardrails there because we were the ones saying, "Hey, we're not going to be Episcopalians because that's the state-run church. We want our freedom to worship God, not blending it with the state." And so that's
and historically, you go back to people like Spurgeon. They have very, very strong things to say about the idea that Baptists would ever blend their faith with the mechanisms of state to sort of, impose their will. I mean, very strong language that I won't necessarily repeat in this video.
That's right.
So it wouldn't be a bad thing if we got back to that, I don't think.
Yeah, good. All right, so what do you think are the compelling reasons, or the most compelling reasons for being a Baptist?
Well, I think my answer would be, I think the best answer for anybody to be any religious persuasion, and that's because you're convinced that it's true. And for me, as you well know, we've had these conversations for years and years. I have a great respect for many Christian traditions and many denominations, and I draw deeply from those traditions in my own life and in my own thinking. But for me, as I test everything by the scriptures, fundamentally, I'm convinced that the sorts of things we're talking about today are true. So that would be my first answer. If you believe in believers' baptism, and biblical authority, and autonomy of the local church, sole competency, these sorts of things, separation of church and state, that's a good reason to be Baptist. But I would say there are benefits to Baptist life. We don't have to be totally cut off from tradition like some people think. We're free to draw deeply from the great diversity of Christian tradition. We're just not bound to follow any exactly where we don't see it matching up with Scripture. So I think that's been of great benefit in my life. As I read the church fathers, as I read sort of the great Christian saints and all of that kind of stuff, they've benefited me, but I'm not bound in the way that I might be if I belonged to another tradition.
Right.
So there is freedom there. That's
Yeah, so none of those people are Baptist, but you can draw upon them because you are a Baptist, and there's freedom to do so. I think the point about conviction is really what it comes down to. Are you convinced that the way that Baptists understand the distinctives of a church, what it means to be a believer, and how that best fits together according to the New Testament is what it comes down to. And I'm just thinking along the lines too of why would anyone want to be a Baptist? And I think you've identified that as well, because you have this tremendous amount of resource. But that does lead to another question. Some critics of Baptist life accuse Baptists of being a sort of rootless tradition, that we're just cherry picking everything and we're not rooted in any confession or creed or denominational structure. We're not even part of the little c Catholic Church, the broader Catholic Church being the universal church, not the Roman Catholic Church. But that's the accusation we hear sometimes. So
and we've played into it, right? So this has not been something that's popped up out of nowhere, right? Baptists have emphasized this, right? You often get two sort of opposing pictures of the origins of Baptists in sort of popular Baptist culture. And the one is that we've been around sort of as a separate entity since the founding of the First Baptist Church of Jerusalem in the first century on the one hand, right? And the other is that, we sort of almost popped up out of nowhere. No one has ever sort of figured it out, and then we figured it out as Baptists. And when you put it that way, it sounds very much like we're rootless, right? But the fact is that that's not really a historical picture of where we come from. We, like every denomination, have historical roots. We have traditions. There's this long, winding road of church history, of theological development, of changes in practice and ecclesiastical structure and all that kind of stuff that makes the rise of Baptists comprehensible. So I would encourage Baptists especially to grab hold of our tradition a little bit. Our origin can only be rightly understood within the context of the English separatists, which are only understood within the context of the Reformation of the English Church, which it can only be understood in the context of the broader Reformation, which itself can only be understood in the context of the Western Augustinian Christianity. And the things that we hold dear were formulated in councils celebrated by East and West, going all the way back to the New Testament. So we should celebrate our traditions. We should learn from those who came before us, even if they looked very, very different in their practice and their belief than we as modern-day Baptists look. So we're as much to blame as anybody for that perception, but we actually aren't rootless. We aren't sort of this ahistorical development in history, and that's a good thing. We have a rich history to draw upon.
So it's interesting, and we don't have to go down the real rabbit hole that lies here. But when we think about Baptist history, there's even debate within Baptist life, even our particular segment of Baptist life in Southern Baptist life. There's debate about what actually is our history. So I've got a couple of questions kind of looming here. So one would be, there's great variety in Baptist life, but what is it about the history that we can say about sort of the streams of Baptist life? Where do we come from? What are some of maybe the myths or misconceptions around that? And then the second thing would be, what about all the differences in modern Baptist churches? Without going into great detail, obviously we can't sketch out here where every single brand of Baptist comes from, because that would be a tremendous project.
So I think So we're not going to settle the question of, sort of where are the true Baptist origins.
Right. And we're not Baptist historians
Right.
either. This is really an
So
academic
if we were to
game.
try and delve into it, we'd probably get facts wrong and stuff like
Yeah,
that. But
absolutely.
the basic debate is like, did we come from the English Reformation or did we come from the Anabaptist, the Radical
Yeah,
Reformation?
right.
And I think pretty much everybody recognizes that there's some of both.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's enough for us here. Like, we could argue about how much influence there was, but we are not a product only of the Anabaptists, right? We are a product of, maybe some Anabaptist thought as it comes into, the English influence, the products of the English Reformation and separatists and all of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, we won't go down that road. I think you rightly want us to not go down.
Yeah.
go down that road.
But that's good. That's kind of the thing I wanted you to point out. Just there's two broad streams, and that actually can kind of answer the second part. That has a great deal of influence over the variety of Baptists we see today. Some would say, no, actually our tradition goes back more toward this stream, and others would say, no, ours goes back more toward this one. And for Southern Baptists, it's very clear that the Reformation group, not the Radical Reformers, not the Anabaptist group, but the Separatists are really what informed Southern Baptist life in the beginning. Now, of course, that changes as Southern Baptists are in the Americas and all sorts of things happen there. The Great Awakenings influenced a tremendous amount of Baptist
there's not a straight line.
It's a very jagged line, isn't it?
You can be a Presbyterian today who comes to be influenced by Anabaptist writing, and there's and start your own church, right? So anybody could be influenced by anything. But these are sort of the two broad streams, I think.
And I guess one of the fascinating points, just to wrap that point up, would be that for the early Baptists, as we know them, the ones, say, writing the 1644, the 1689 London Baptist Confession, are self-consciously drawing on Presbyterian documents. So they're identifying more closely with those Reformed groups than they are with the Anabaptists. In fact, they're saying, no, we're not the Anabaptists, those early Baptists.
Yeah, especially,
So that's an interesting
especially there are reasons why they want to emphasize their connection to their, sort of Reformed brothers and sisters
for
in
safety
England,
among
and also to sort of distance themselves from any Anabaptist connection. Quite aside from any historical questions you might have about them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to get back, this is actually a good point to get back to what you're saying about variety in Baptist life. There's variety in every denomination, right? So our particular way of expressing the Christian life is such that we cannot impose conformity. We cannot make everybody look and act and say what we want them to what we might want to impose. And the fact is, we wouldn't want to impose it because we're Baptists. That's not what we do. But there is a great variety in Baptist life, just like all other denominations, right? You can find independent fundamentalist Baptists, and you can find very, very progressive Baptists. But you can also find the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and you can find very, very progressive Presbyterians in the PCUSA. There's a wide variety of sort of diverse traditions, even within, say, the Roman Catholic Church. Right? You can find very, very conservative Roman Catholics, which would look very different than conservative Baptists.
That's right.
And you can find very, very progressive Catholics. So it's just a function of, the fact that we're all humans. There is variety of thought, and Baptist distinctives allow for that maybe more than most.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, you're driving down the road, and Southern Baptist churches differ, but then there are the variety of Baptists themselves. What you mentioned, one, independent fundamentalist Baptists are going to differ from Southern Baptist churches, and you've got the Free Will Baptist, Regular Baptist, Missionary Baptist, Primitive Baptist. There's dozens of others, but those are some. And all of those are going to look different, but still broadly under that umbrella of free church, local church autonomy, commitment to biblical authority, of course, within their own understanding of how things are interpreted. And that's where we debate on how is this passage interpreted, what is sound exegesis, but we're not really having a debate about creeds and confessions and things like that. And so that's an interesting point about Baptist life. So we do have a tradition. We are rooted. We do come out of a very clear stream of history. We can trace our roots back to the Protestant Reformation. At the very least, we can say that much. And then, of course, along with Protestants, we would say we go back all the way to the New Testament, just not Baptist in particular, right?
Right.
What about advice or suggestions? What advice or suggestions would you give to Baptists today? So we're shooting these videos thinking, well, maybe someone wants to know more about what it means to be Baptist. They've always been Baptist, or maybe they're exploring, or right now Christianity's sort of in flux, and people are trying to figure out what's next in the Western world for Christianity. So what is it in 2020 that might be compelling about being Baptist in that sense? And what advice might you give to people who are thinking about being Baptist or are already Baptist? What suggestions would you have?
Well, I think we've already addressed over the course of our conversation what we think is compelling about being Baptist. But I would say if this is something that you are thinking about and you've come to believe that the things that we believe are true, and you are interested in a tradition that is firmly rooted in your responsibility and your freedom, but your responsibility before God for your beliefs and for your actions, that's, we might very well be for you, but fundamentally it's, if that's what you believe, here we are. But when it comes to advice for Baptists, I think growing out of our conversation here, we might say, first of all, as much as we want to emphasize freedom in Baptist life as part of our distinctives, we need to emphasize the flip side of that coin, which is responsibility. It's not freedom for itself, it's freedom as a means to living and doing what God would have us do, and obedience to God's calling on our lives. I would also say, and this is something that we've talked about, that there's a tendency, especially in certain parts of America, to think of Baptists as the generic sort of Christian, the default Christian setting, And the fact is that we have a rich history with important and valuable distinctives. So it's okay to celebrate being Baptists, right? And that doesn't just mean generic Christian. But at the same time, we need to maybe do better about valuing those who came before us in church history, who we, to whom we owe an awful lot, even if their churches didn't look anything like ours as 21st century Central Virginia Baptists, right? And also our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world that are part of traditions that are not our own. We have an awful lot to learn from one another as Spirit-indwelt believers. And I guess the last thing I would say, especially in the current climate, but at any time, is that maybe we should think about the way we engage politically. Okay, it's the funny thing about Baptists is that in spite of our emphasis on the separation of church and state, or maybe even because of it, right? I don't know. This is a strange relationship here. Baptists are enormously political people. And that's okay, because politics is actually pretty important, right? What we do in the ballot box, makes a real impact on people around us. That said, we are citizens ultimately of a kingdom not of this world. And we have a mission that can neither be fulfilled through the ballot box or thwarted by it. The political situation is never so good that the world doesn't need our prophetic witness, and it's never so bad that God's victory is in doubt.
Right.
So do your political duty by all means, but remember that whatever is going on around us, our calling to proclaim God's truth, to love God, to love our neighbor, to seek justice is the same.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, those are great. And I think I would just affirm some of those as far as knowing our roots, knowing our history, digging into some of the Baptist statements of faith that we have. Mm-hmm. You can go back to our Baptist Faith and Message, which is now in the 2000 edition in Southern Baptist Life, but you can draw pretty much a straight line back to the London Baptist Confession there, and it's a really good idea to just kind of work your way backward through those confessions and see some of those, see what Baptists were saying before us, knowing the Baptists that came before us, some of the great ones before us. John Leland comes to mind as a Virginia Baptist, someone who was a deep thinker politically as well as theologically. So he's a helpful one. And then, for Baptists, I think really pushing back against the idea that we're some sort of ignorant, uneducated group, but instead insisting that we are adhering to biblical authority, doing careful work around Scripture, committing to distinctively Baptist doctrine, and not sort of just ducking our head in the sand, and not running out the door to do political stuff always, but instead really embracing what it means to be Baptist believers. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully that gives you some more insight into Baptist life, what it means to be Baptist, and we hope that you found it enriching, we hope that you found it encouraging, and we hope that it might make you Baptist. And we'll hope to shoot some new videos in the future, but we're so glad that you watched with us today.